Let's get started with a word of prayer. Father, thank you so much for your word. We pray, Lord, that you will watch over us at a very difficult time of human history, that you will protect us and help us to live lives that glorify you in every way. Pray that you will let this message be clear as possible. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, today I'm going to talk about be vexed, not vaxed. It is a interesting time to be alive. I'm going to talk some about the coronavirus and some implications of that today, geopolitics. And then I also have some things I want to share with you from the scriptures and just some thoughts in general. But it is a period of time where we certainly live where the events that are at least foreshadows of the exact things that will take place are manifesting themselves. You can see everything coming together. It is, and I've used this for many years, a world disrupted, and it certainly is a world disrupted. It is it's a vexing time to be alive. And it should be. That's a good reaction. That's okay. I think that's actually a godly reaction. You know, in Luke chapter 19, or excuse me, Luke 17, Jesus was giving indications of what it would be like around the time that he returned. And in Luke 17, verse 26, he said, "And as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it also be in the days of the Son of Man. They did eat, they drank, they married wives, and were given in marriage until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and the flood came and destroyed them all." Verse 28, "Likewise also as it was in the days of Lot, they did eat, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they builded. But the same day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all." As you know, I've actually gotten accused of talking about it too much, the transgender agenda and some of the LGBTQ agenda items that I've been critical of and that I think are indicative of the time in which we live. I've been accused of focusing on that too much. But it is a big problem in our society and culture. And you wonder how long God will be patient with America and the West for allowing such things. It may be that we are at that time where God may actually be going to judge America and the West. We may be seeing the foundations, the beginnings of a concerted effort by certain people in the world to take down America. It's very easy to make that case. But at the end today, I'm going to talk about people who thrived in difficult times and circumstances. Who didn't live in America, they lived in evil empires that God judged. Yet they thrived. But as I've talked about this transgender agenda, and by the way, there was some good news on this week. Out of the UK, they have put in place legislation or rules that's going to say no one under the age of 18 is allowed to get sex reassignment surgery. I wish America would have the courage to do something like that, because it is child abuse. We all know that. But Lot lived in a pretty bad place. He lived in Sodom and Gomorrah, and he was taken out the day he was taken out. Sodom was judged. And Peter talks about this, and this is sort of where this is where I got my title. In 2 Peter chapter 2, he talks about Lot. And what Lot was going through is he saw these things. And I've said many times, I don't even know that Lot had to put up with drag queen story hour at the local library where they invite children. But nevertheless, Lot's reaction to all of this was, 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 7 says, "And delivered just Lot, vexed with the filthy conversation of the wicked, for that righteous man, dwelling among them, in seeing and hearing, vexed his righteous soul from day to day with their unlawful deeds. The Lord knoweth how to deliver the godly out of temptations, and to reserve the unjust unto the day of judgment to be punished." So Lot had the right reaction. So if you look at the things that are going on, and there's many things to be going on many different levels in the world today, and you are vexed, that's probably a pretty good reaction. There's a lot of things to be upset about. So let me touch on a few things that are going on in the world, and some developments that I think might have some prophetic significance or relate to different subjects in Bible prophecy. Emmanuel Macron, this was a couple weeks ago in Financial Times, and I've been reading more of Financial Times. It's published in the UK. I think they're doing a very good job covering the economic and other issues that are apparent. But they had a long couple-page interview with Emmanuel Macron a couple weeks ago, about April 19th. It says, Macron warns EU will unravel unless the bloc embraces financial solidarity. And then the title of the interview they called Thinking the Unthinkable. And he was interviewed. There's no sound with this, but there were things that he talked about, and he says, is Europe been weakened by the crisis? I'm not as skeptical for the multilateralism, because multilateralism, he says, might need a change of globalization, which is perhaps happening now. When I look at what we've been going through the last couple of years altogether, we've been living a very big crisis. First, there were threats throughout the world that touched every continent. Then there was a change in the migration pattern that was very unsettling. Then happened a brand new phenomenon, which was, at least in its strongest expression, a climatic phenomenon. He's a globalist climate change guy. And here we have the health phenomenon. And 10 years ago, we experienced an unprecedented economic crisis before experiencing this one. And all of this shows that we are always very interdependent. Simply put, the crisis we are living through, and that's what makes it similar to the ecological crisis, is shining a light in front of us. Nobody is asking the question as to whether it's necessary to shut down the economy in order to save lives. And nobody thought it was possible of us. That's a very deep anthropological shock. And we have half the planet at a standstill to save lives. It's actually more than that. There is no precedent in history. So I don't know how to outline what the consequences will be, he says. He goes on later in the interview to talk about what he thinks about the European Union. Those people don't protect you when you face a crisis. He's talking about strong people, strong authoritarian leaders. The virus, take care of it alone. They are nice, deep down. They are for Europe when talking about exports of produced goods. When it's about cheap manpower and car parts, we don't make it in our countries, but they are not for Europe when you need to come together. It does not exist. That's the reality. So we are at a moment of truth. It consists in knowing if the EU is a political project or a market project solely. I think it is a political project. When it is political, what comes first is the notions of solidarity at stake. There are notions of solidarity at stake. The economy depends on it. Let's not forget that the economy is a moral science. But when everything explodes, your P&L living, this is what we're living. If we don't, is there a risk of the fall of the Eurozone? Yes, he says, and the European idea. I don't know how it will be, but it's evident. It's evident. We are living what until 6 months ago was unthinkable. To think of the moment we'll go out or we'll with our former habits, I think it's a cognitive dissonance. I can't tell you how this crisis will end. I am saying it with humility. I don't know when it will end, what consequences it will bring, nor what psychological toll we'll pay. And anthropologically speaking, how will we get through this? I mean, regarding the others, regarding the society, regarding the world, humanity had become nomadic in the last century. Imagine there were 1.5 billion people traveling every year. 1.5 billion people. Humankind had never done that. There was a permanent diffusion of information. 1.5 billion people at least circulating, and everything has changed. All of a sudden you go back to a humankind where we fragment in everything without value that was produced by billions, doesn't get to your home, where what I thought useless becomes rare and exceptional, where you will have to reproduce it yourself, where we ask the people, don't move, not even a step. It's a profound change. We'll emerge as different people. So regardless of what you think of Macron, some people put him up as a potential candidate for the Antichrist. He is a globalist. He wants to reunite the European Union, maybe in a smaller fashion, get rid of some of the baggage. And even though he said in his speech, in his talk, he was a bit hypocritical, I think, because he was talking about, well, when the crisis comes, we really don't get together. Well, Italy had a major crisis with the virus outbreak and many deaths in excess of normal. They were pleading for help from the other European countries, and the other European countries pretty much said, hey, Italy, you're on your own, deal with it. So that's caused a significant fracture in the European Union, to the extent that the European Union that we know and knew just a few months ago may no longer exist. And many things that we knew 2 months ago may no longer exist. Who knows if they're coming back? So let me just say a few things about the crisis. Now, I do have a bit of a different view of the crisis, that I don't think the virus was a hoax or fake. I think that is a difficult problem that people have had to deal with. Now, that does not mean that once this crisis emerged or was made more serious than it should have been, that there were people that were willing to step in immediately to take advantage of that situation with their various agendas. And there are numerous. Whether it was to attack President Trump, whether it was to bring in more globalism and interdependence, even though that's one of the major causes of the problems that we have. But there are some things that are just different. And I read a broad swath of papers from all sorts of different political views. This happens to be an article in the Financial Times. Death toll 60% than higher, or higher than reported, 60% higher than reported. And the thing that, and I know people say, well, there are some COVID-19 deaths that have been reported as COVID-19 deaths which were not COVID-19 deaths. And I accept that as accurately stated. I would also say that there are flu deaths that are counted as flu deaths that are not flu deaths. There's always comorbidity on flu deaths. I just find it interesting that people cite CDC statistics on the seasonal flu death like it's gospel truth. Yet if you cite CDC statistics or other statistics on COVID-19 deaths, it's all fake news. It seems to be a bit of cognitive dissonance there. But one of the things that has been noted in New York City, London, Stockholm, England, Wales, is that there has been a spike of deaths above what they normally expect on a day-to-day average. Now, the average in New York goes up and down from season to season, more in the winter die than usually in the summer, but there's sort of a static line of a certain number of deaths per day. Those numbers of deaths per day in the month of April were up almost 300% in New York City. That's not normal. In Stockholm, 75%, England and Wales, 37%, Spain. Ecuador, in this one city in Ecuador, a 347% increase in the daily number of deaths over the course of the month. So this is not normal, and there's probably a lot of explanations for it. Part of the reason, so while I think there's overcounting of COVID deaths, I think there's also significant undercounting of COVID deaths because people are dying at home. And many people are dying at home for a whole bunch of different reasons, because people aren't going to the doctor or the hospital because they've been told, don't come to the doctor or the hospital. So people are dying of a heart attack at home. But in certain places, like New York City, the crematoria have been overwhelmed. I could show you pictures of a funeral home in Queens with the young 24-year-old funeral director. This was in the Times of London about a week and a half ago. And she's standing in the parlor room where they would have the body laid out for viewing on a normal funeral. And the room is full of chairs, and there's 2 chairs. And on each chair, there are 2 or 3 cardboard boxes, long boxes, which are bodies. And she's like, I can't keep up. We're having to ship bodies. They had to get a special rule in place to allow them to ship bodies across state lines to Connecticut to cremate them, because there's just been so many. And so what's happening there, regardless of your view of the virus, something is going on there, and people are dying in a much, much higher number. There's not been a spike in deaths like that in New York City since 9/11. And we all know what happened on September 11th, 2001. And so they're running around trying to figure out what it was that caused their deaths. In some cases, they're attributing a lot of them to COVID-19. In some, they're investigating further. And so you'll see this adjustment of numbers up and down for a while until they finally get things under hand. But, the exact count is not necessarily the most important thing right now. They have a problem that they have to deal with. They have a lot of people that need acute care. And we've seen some drugs develop or treatment strategies develop and that type of thing. So my view is it's a problem. There are things that are happening that are not normal. I mean, we see these stories in New York, where they found, 40, 60 bodies in a U-Haul, unrefrigerated U-Haul truck. The neighbors called because the smell and liquid seeping out from the back of the truck was putrid. And I don't know that in any seasonal flu death situation, even in bad years, that we've had to deal with that particular problem. But the main thing is the whole healthcare system has collapsed, because until just recently they'd stopped all elective surgeries. They even considered some cancer surgeries elective surgeries. And people weren't getting treated, and people are dying of regular things at a greater rate as well. And the whole healthcare system has just been blown apart. Doctors and nurses laid off, rural hospitals. Many hospitals will fail, probably never reopen, like restaurants are never going to reopen. It's a major problem. And I think you could validly say that the people who pushed all the lockdowns didn't consider everything that might happen in its wake. I also note that the oil crisis has continued, the oil price crisis. Now remember that the oil price war, started between Russia and Saudi Arabia back in January. China shut down. The biggest supplier of goods on the planet shut down for like 75 days, and they're still not really fully open. And even as they've opened, they've had small outbreaks in a factory or whatever, and they've had to shut the factory down again. I mean, I know people who have a nice car, Mercedes or something like that, and I've heard complaints from them. I can't get the brake pads for my Mercedes because they come from China. And it's a problem if you need brake pads for your Mercedes, but it's also, at least you have a Mercedes. You may not be able to stop when you go someplace, but at least you have the Mercedes. But when China shut down, that dropped demand for oil in China by 40 to 50%. And Russia and Saudi Arabia, which are very dependent on oil revenues for their economy and social programs, and in Russia for their defense industry and other things, they rushed into the market. They started flooding the market with oil to try to protect market share. Well, as they flooded the market with oil and demand dropped in China, then as the virus spread, demand dropped everywhere. And demand is down probably 30% worldwide. And we saw a week ago that the oil price, at least on one section of the oil market, West Texas Intermediate crude, dropped into negative territory. In other words, you're going to have to pay people to take the oil away. And when you talk to people and analysts, they always use the term now, this is unprecedented, we've never seen this, we almost can't explain how this happened. Now, it's been explained, I think I talked a little bit about this last week, that it's sometimes called the Cushing Problem, because in Cushing, Oklahoma, there's a big storage area, and that storage area is about 72% full of oil right now, continues to grow every day as more oil is pumped in. And they have these massive pipelines. They can bring in like 6 billion barrels of oil per day into Cushing, and they can ship out 6 million barrels per day. But the problem now is 6.5 million barrels are coming in, but hardly anything is leaving, and all the space there is spoken of, because the people have oil stored there. They have no place to send it by pipeline to refineries because the demand has dropped so much. 90% of you go out and look around. We live on a flight path sometimes for the Columbus airport, and every now and then you'll go like, oh yeah, I remember that's what a plane sounds like when it flies over the house. Because we're not hearing that hardly at all anymore. So air travel is down roughly 90%. They're big users of fuel. All that fuel is just sitting there. It has to be stored. It's not getting used up, and everything in the pipe. And so what happens is, as the storage fills up, they have to shut down wells. So in this article in the Wall Street Journal, it says this: focus in closely, and oil prices turned negative recently because of technicalities in the futures market and storage capacity in Oklahoma. But zoom out, and negative oil prices are merely the weirdest illustration of the destruction of demand in the economy, and fit with two long-standing negative prices in Europe for money and for electricity. In all three cases, the problem is that supply can't respond quickly to changes in demand, while demand can't or won't increase quickly enough to take advantage of the lower prices. This isn't normal. In almost all industries, when demand collapses, production is fast. Production is fast turned off. Car factories are closed, and no company would choose to keep them open if it had to pay you to take a new car. I saw a report yesterday that one car factory up in Michigan is going to stay closed through the end of the year, a big car factory. Even in the cases where production has to continue, it would be weird to pay people to consume it. Farmers can't stop producing milk, but it would be dumb to pay people to drink it when they can use it to fertilize their fields for free. But oil wells aren't like car factories, and oil isn't like milk. Closed oil wells are less productive when reopened. That means it is better to keep them running even if their output is temporarily worthless, as long as the owner expects prices to recover. The oil just can't be dumped because the toxic sludge is highly regulated. Usually it would be stored to sell when prices recover, but for now, storage is basically full. Oil prices fell faster than ever before because demand fell faster than ever before. Worse, demand for oil isn't rising the way it usually does when prices fall because of the lockdown. Even when things are normal, it can take a long time for oil use to catch up with lower prices because it needs a change to behavior, such as driving more or buying a less fuel-efficient big vehicle. It's a major problem. I don't think it's going to recover soon. There were many reports this week, GDP likely to go from bad to worse. This is just the beginning, said Beth Ann Bovino, S&P Global's chief U.S. economist, who estimates that GDP dropped at a 7.5% annual rate in the first quarter in the United States. Other countries have seen similar drops in GDP. Sweden, for example, I think I have the numbers correct. Sweden dropped 13%, even though they didn't they put restrictions. They asked people not to get in groups of 50, above 50. But even in Sweden, where the restrictions were much less, they've had economic carnage. Businesses are failing there just like they are here in the United States. Economists surveyed by the Wall Street Journal expect the department to say GDP, the broadest measure of goods and services produced across the country, fell at a seasonally adjusted annual rate of 3.5%. But this is something that hasn't happened for many, many years in a quarter. It's just not good. So here's a picture of how the GDP drop. So you have to go back 10 years to the economic crisis of 2008 and 9 to find similar drops. As one economist said, Richard Moody, chief economist at Regions Financial, this is like a really bad hurricane hitting the entire economy, all of it at the same time. The Eurozone report coming out Wednesday is just a hint of what's coming in the second quarter, said Ian Shepherdson, chief economist at Pantheon Macroeconomics. We also have problems with the supply chains. The supply chains are, as they say, they're going from bad to worse. Now, is it planned? Is it not planned? Look, in my legal career, which at the end of this month will be my 40th anniversary, so I've been around a long time, and I've advised clients on potential liabilities of things that they want to do, whether that's in a product liability case with a drug company or a pharmaceutical company or a gas line, a gas supply company and gas line, transmission line operator, is they have to consider potential legal liability. So we see the processing plants shutting down all over the country. even American-owned ones, and part of the problem is they are having virus outbreaks among the workers, and the workers won't come to work. It is a fairly skilled job, and they just can't replace people overnight, so they shut down the plant. They shut down the plant. That means there's less meat getting processed. Well, with less meat being processed, the farmers who have hogs and chickens and stuff, they have to send them someplace. They can't send them someplace, so they have to euthanize them. And then eventually you see this show up in the, I think there's already been kind of a spike in meat prices, a little bit of increase. This is not going to resolve itself in a month. This is a big problem. And the people that run the processing plants, they're in business to make money, and they want to keep operating. They've tried to keep operating, but it's not working very well. Another thing that's happened is ethanol in America has collapsed. Now, there's a rule statute in place that says there's supposed to be a certain amount of ethanol in your gasoline, and ethanol plants are closing all over the place because the demand has dropped so much. I've worked in different cases, both on the farm side and the lender side with farms, and I can tell you that farmers and trucking companies that ship grain to ethanol plants, their business has gone to complete zero. And this is a problem. I mean, this is the disruption and carnage that we're seeing going through the economy is unprecedented. Ethanol plant closures are expected to reduce domestic corn consumption by 375 million barrels, the U.S. Department of Agriculture said in a report earlier this month. That is one reason the Food and Agricultural Policy Research Institute at the University of Missouri estimates that farm income could be reduced by as much as $20 billion or 19% in 2020. That's if everything goes well. And so inventories of ethanol have been building up. They don't want any more. And so this is a problem. Supply chains are disrupted. Before all of the restaurants shut down, schools and restaurants, colleges, universities, and everything, they have a need for food because they have students, and restaurants sell food. They took about 60% of U.S. food production. Well, when that business goes away and drops by 90% or 80% overnight, there's a huge disruption in the supply chain, and shifting that from commercial buyers of food products to consumers takes some time. It's very disruptive. And I don't think we've seen the bottom of the market, but again, if I was that good at playing the markets, I wouldn't be here. So farmers are destroying their crops. It's a big problem. Another problem is what's going to happen in the fall. We have colleges. Coronavirus burst the U.S. college bubble. As this article notes, bubbles are bursting everywhere, and America's most prestigious export, higher education, won't be immune. Universities are like landlocked cruise ships, places where all-you-can-eat buffets and plenty of beer, but almost no way of social distancing. Many colleges are considering running online classes into the autumn and beyond, but that requires additional resources that most are ill-equipped to afford. Even before coronavirus, 30% of colleges tracked by rating agency Moody's were running deficits, while 15% of public universities had less than 90 days of cash on hand. And we haven't even talked about the impact that this is going to have on state governments. So where our governor here in Ohio issues shutdown orders, all of those shutdown orders result in less tax revenue, sales tax, gasoline tax, whatever. And so now they're talking about allowing states to file for bankruptcy, which they've not allowed previously. They may amend the statute to permit that. These things are just unbelievable. In an article the other day in the Wall Street Journal, talked about the Federal Reserve is breaking its taboos to prop up the economy. The Federal Reserve is redefining central banking, it said, by lending widely to businesses, states, and cities in its efforts to insulate the U.S. economy from the coronavirus pandemic. It is breaking century-old taboos about who gets money from the central bank in a crisis, on what terms, and what risk it will take about getting that money back. The Fed balance sheet, I think this is this slide, Well, here's a chart of monthly restaurant same-store sales changed from a year earlier. So you can see the change. Through March, it's probably even worse if you consider April. Here's another chart about restaurant layoffs, 8 million people. Oilprice.com. This is a little bit disjointed, I guess. I don't have all my slides organized by topic, but that's because it's almost impossible to organize things by topic because everything is so related. And this big article in oilprice.com the other day on April 30th, the oil wells that will never recover. And they say the cheapest storage is in the ground, but when you shut down the well, anything that was wrong with the well will come to the fore, and reopening it is not just like turning on the tap. This week there were 30 million. We reached 30 million jobless claims in the last 6 weeks. An incredible number, something that we've never really seen before. This is an interesting article about a Cleveland restaurant on the near west side, not too far from Lake Erie, called Spice. And it's a very interesting article to read about what the owner of the restaurant. It was a popular restaurant. It was expensive. It was like $24 for a pork chop. But it was a farm to table. He had suppliers. He had people. He had bakers. All these people that supplied him. But he had a very thriving catering business that funded the restaurant. Well, guess what happened to the catering business? How many catering jobs do you think you're going to get when weddings are limited to 3 or 4 people and you're not allowed to have gatherings? And so he made the painful decision the other day, or this past week, to just shut the thing down and never reopen. And so if you look at Google Maps and you put in Spice Restaurant, Cleveland, Ohio, on Detroit Avenue, it says permanently closed. And that story is going to repeat itself over and over and over and over again. And these are real people with real jobs, real lives, entrepreneurs that do what they love and love what they do, and they sometimes make good money doing it, but now the whole thing has just been destroyed. This is an interesting article on Press TV. This was, the other day was the 72nd anniversary when they celebrated the 72nd anniversary of the founding of Israel. And the UK thing said it marked the Press TV, the Iranian government news agency, said UK congratulates Israel as it marks 72 years since occupying Palestine. Talk maybe a little bit more about that. Report released the other day, I think Friday, Five Eyes dossier. The Five Eyes would be 5 major countries: UK, US, Australia, Canada, and I forget the other one. Might be France. They've all said that, listen, what China did was a giant cover-up, and there's a lot of information. You'll see more of that released in the press over the next couple of weeks. I mentioned earlier, healthcare industry feels economic pain. People are talking about how the whole world changes. You see articles in all the foreign policy magazine like, is globalism dead? And I think the general consensus is it's not doing well yet, but we see people trying to push the globalist agenda in this crisis. You saw some of the quotes from Emmanuel Macron. In foreign policy, there's an interesting article, how life in our cities will look after the coronavirus pandemic. They had 11 experts. A lot of them said that, are people going to want to live in cities like they have before? And they cited, one of these articles cited the situation that happened after the Spanish flu pandemic. Around in the 1920s, the population of New York City dropped by 1 million, Manhattan. Went from 2.5 million to 1.5. I saw articles this week, Wall Street real estate section on Friday, of home rentals just spiking in Greenwich, Connecticut, Westchester County, and out on Long Island, where people are paying anywhere from $20, $30, $40, even $50,000 a month to rent these mansions because they want to be out of the city. And will that continue? And then the question becomes, well, I don't know if it will continue. because they have to take the train in to Manhattan if they're going to work in Manhattan. And who wants to be on the train right now? The ridership on the New York City subway, and I remember, I think the last time I was up there was around 2008 in the city doing business, and I stayed out on Long Island, and I took the train in, the Long Island Railroad, and then I got the subway to go up to near the Radio City Music Hall, big theater. There's a bunch of office buildings there. I had a deposition. And I remember sitting on this. I took the express by mistake, so I ended up a little bit farther north than I wanted, so I had to get off and get back on. And it was rush hour, so I had to sit there it was the fifth train to where I could finally squeeze in. I can assure you that nobody was practicing social distancing on that subway trip. And then when I got in on one side and had to get off on the other, and with luggage and everything, it was a little difficult. Fortunately, I don't have a problem asserting myself in space. And so urban housing will get cheaper. People think, everything's coming back. Who knows? In American Magazine, there is an interesting article, speaking of Emmanuel Macron and the Pope. The Pope called Emmanuel Macron. You can go to the American Magazine. It's a Jesuit publication. And in that article, they talked about how the Pope said, Emmanuel Macron helped get the wars stopped, helped get everything back economically, forgive the debts of poor nations. And also, by the way, it also mentions the fact that Macron was educated in a Jesuit school. He then worked for the Rothschild banking organization before he went into politics. Married his high school teacher in the meantime. Let's see, that's the ethanol thing again. Things are not going well right now for Vladimir Putin. Russia is in a bit of a spot. You remember, it was just about 6 weeks ago that Putin put in place changes to the Russian constitution. Proposed changes, they were approved by the Russian Supreme Court, but they had to be submitted to a referendum of the people, which was supposed to take place this week, but it got canceled. And Russia's had a fairly severe outbreak of the coronavirus. They tried to cover it up, but they're having problems too. So right now, I just don't see this. We always talk about Ezekiel 38 and 39. I just don't see that happening anytime soon. But I also know that when countries are in economic crisis, a lot of time that leads to war. And who knows what China, who's had their GDP drop more than it's ever dropped before in its history and for a long, long time, and Russia and everybody having problems, a lot of times the result of that is war. And so, as the New York Times noted yesterday or the other day, Kremlin's man of action is struggling to find his stride. As I said, the April 24th referendum on constitutional amendments was canceled. They canceled their big May Day celebration and that type of thing. Elsewhere in the Middle East, Lebanon is on the brink of crisis. Their banking system, financial system has collapsed. They've been in lockdown. People are coming out, and people are just not happy. Caroline Glick has a pretty good article in Israel Hayom from Friday. It's titled The Final Days of the Iran Nuclear Deal and What's Going to Happen in Iran Pushing to Advance its ability to produce nuclear weapons. And the whole thing is in a giant mess. And at the same time, Russia has announced that as soon as the target date comes up in September, October, for the end of the deal, they're going to be selling all kinds of arms to Iran. That's not a good situation. But I highly recommend you can find an English version of her article at carolineglick.com. Recommend that you read it. So this is Kansas City, Missouri. Frequently asked questions. They have put into place what they call the 10-10-10 rule. And they have frequently asked questions about this. And they essentially say non-essential business operations that are not open to the public can resume in-person and delivery operations provided they operate in accordance with guidance provided by the health department and allow workers to maintain social distancing. But then they have this provision. And this is troubling to me because, look, I like the Constitution. I like the rights we have under the Constitution. And I don't like even a little bit of restrictions on it. But the frequently asked question here, to Kansas City, Missouri, are religious services, weddings, and funerals allowed? Yes. After May 6th, in-person religious gatherings, including weddings and funerals, may resume subject to the 10-10-10 rule, if held inside, and limited to 50 people outside. I guess even if you have a giant parking lot. I drove by one of the local sports bars and they had the park. I'm like, what is this parking lot full? And they had a band outside playing and people were sitting in their cars listening to it. But it also says here, provided social distancing precautions are followed and event organizers maintain records of all attendees. I do not like this. This one bothers me. Liberty Counsel has some things that they said about it. And one of the things that they said was, Liberty Counsel said this: I am running out of adjectives to describe how completely insane the tyrannical abuses launched by state governors and local officials against pastors and churches are becoming. It is as if these leaders never bothered so much as to glance at the Constitution they swore to uphold and defend. They seem to be governing from some make-believe dystopian viewpoint. Well, that's, and I'm bothered by it. So the question is, how do we change it? And so I'm okay if people want to go protest and that type of thing. People need to remember what happened when November comes, or whenever an election comes up. There's also a report in the Wall Street Journal yesterday that countries that kept a lid on coronavirus look to each other to revive their economies. And they're talking about 7 countries that have sort of joined together. Denmark, Austria, Czech Republic, Australia, Greece, Israel, New Zealand have joined together to try to make some kind of situation so that they'll allow travel between those countries, but nobody else. And a lot of these countries are heavily dependent on tourism for revenue, and they're trying to revive that and get that started back up. And I just don't know how quickly that's going to go. Another report, this is out of a study in the UK, says that coronavirus kills people at an average a decade before their time. Study's fine. So even in the upper reaches of elderly people, on average, the coronavirus is killing them a decade before they would normally die. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of challenges to this certificate. Here's a copy of the paper, COVID-19, Exploring the Implications of the Long-Term Condition Type and Extent of Multimorbidity on Years of Life Loss, a Modeling Study. And again, these things are not the same. There are some strange things going on. Whether the virus outbreak it certainly was not as bad as people predicted, some of the models predicted, but there's still some things going on that are just not quite right, that need further investigation and explanation. There are a lot of people dying in some places, not every place, but they've had major problems. They've had outbreaks. They've shut down people pretty much going in and out of the Navajo Nation and New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, because of a horrible virus outbreak out in the middle of the Southwest desert, which doesn't seem to compute because it's warmer there. But they do live in smaller, tighter communities, which sort of brings into mind the concept of viral load. The more virus you're exposed to, the worse you'll get it. And so there's a lot of speculation, particularly in the Christian community, particularly on my Facebook page. I'm still being said probably over 100 videos per day of different theories. Sometimes in the space of 5 minutes, I'll be sent the same video 9 times. And I will say sometimes people have sent me things and I've responded back that I don't think that video, I think there's some mistakes in that video. I think a lot of it's good, a lot of the information is good, but I think there's some assumptions that are incorrect, and I've been unfriended and blocked quite a bit and told that, well, you're just a dumb sheeple and you don't understand what's going on. But I do know that for a long time, ever since the last huge worldwide pandemic in 2018, or 1918, 1920, when about somewhere between 65 and 120 million people died around the world after World War I. People in public health and other organizations have predicting that we're going to have another one, we're going to have another one, we're going to have another one. Now, I don't know that means that they plan to release a virus, but I think they planned about how they're going to deal with the virus when it happens. And some of them have very bad, evil agendas to put in place. For example, here's this report from the Rockefeller Foundation in 2010, Scenarios for the Future of Technology and International Development. And they have a number of different scenarios that they talk about, but in their lockstep scenario, they have 4 that they discussed. It said a world of tighter top-down government control and more authoritarian leadership with limited innovation and growing citizen pushback. And when you read what this scenario is based on, it sounds eerily like what we're going through right now, which I don't really think is surprising because this is how people are going to react to restrictions on movement. But this is what they wrote in 2010. In 2012, the pandemic that the world had been anticipating for years finally hit. Unlike 2009's H1N1, this new influenza strain, originating from wild geese, was extremely virulent and deadly. Even the most pandemic-prepared nations were quickly overwhelmed when the virus streaked around the world, infecting nearly 20% of the global population and killing 8 million in just 7 months, the majority of them healthy young adults. The pandemic also had a deadly effect on economies. International mobility of both people and goods screeched to a halt, debilitating industries like tourism and breaking global supply chains. Even locally, normally bustling shops and office buildings sat empty for months, devoid of both employees and customers. And I work in a big office building in Columbus. I was down there the other day. It's the headquarters of a big bank. And the executive parking area that has double security was completely empty at noon on Thursday. There were, in the parking garage that I saw, there were less than 20 cars. This is just, it is kind of a zombie apocalypse type movie thing. You feel like you're in the midst of a movie set or something. As this Rockefeller Foundation report says, the pandemic blanketed the planet through disproportionate numbers died in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Central America, where the virus spread like wildfire in the absence of official containment protocols. But even in developed countries, containment was a challenge. The United States' initial policy of strongly discouraging citizens from flying proved deadly in its leniency, accelerating the spread of the virus. This was written 10 years ago before this broke out. Were they prescient? Were they just planning? Were they planning to take advantage of this? And then we also know there's all sorts of theories out there. There was this Event 201 sponsored by Johns Hopkins World Economic Forum and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which was a global pandemic exercise. I'm not going to play you any of this. I think my prophecy update on the last Sunday in January, I think it was January 26th, I played a number, maybe 15 minutes or so of clips from this pandemic exercise that took place. And a lot of people say, well, see, they predicted this, they planned this, but that event, and it's interesting, Event 201 and the zero is really a globe. I think they're trying to make a statement there by their graphic. But in that pandemic exercise, they predicted deaths of 65 million. And we've had, as everybody knows, we've had nowhere near that worldwide. We haven't even had that many number of cases. But that was a death rate of deaths that happened over 18 months. It did involve a coronavirus, but it did not think. This is from the New York Times. Friday, 30 million unemployment claims in the United States filed. And the article goes on to say, might be 30 million actually filed claims, but it's probably double that amount because of restrictions put in on filing unemployment claims after the 2008-2009 financial crisis. It's much more difficult to file for unemployment claims now than it was before. So the number, and you're knocked out at the beginning, not you file the claim and then you get denied later. So we have a major unemployment crisis. Another article from the New York Times yesterday about the Permian Basin in Texas, West Texas, where the oil comes from, and they're just concerned about how do we survive this and what does it look like on the other side, because this is something nobody's ever seen. And U.S. oil production is, for all practical purposes, shut down. So we've gone from just 5 months ago, the biggest oil producer on the planet, to almost zero. We went from what was claimed to be the greatest economy in 80 years to a really, really bad one. And I think the economy was primed for a crash because it was debt fueled, but that's a topic for another discussion. So, a lot of speculation over the last couple weeks. North Korea is a nuclear power. They've threatened us. They launched these missiles. Kim Jong-un had disappeared for about 20 days. He's done this in the past, up to as many as 40 days without any public appearances. He missed a very important holiday, the most important holiday in North Korea. I think it's the birthday of the founder. Nowhere to be found, and supposedly this is Kim this week. Here's some videos from different news outlets. You can see he's a smoker, people cheering that he was there to cut the ribbon at a fertilizer factory, I believe. And so they saw him walking around, cutting the ribbon. They did notice that there was a spot on his one arm, which might indicate that he had a big arterial IV in at some point. If you froze that part, you could probably see it. So supposedly he's okay now, and so there was no worries. But then there are a lot of people saying, no, that's a double because he's only 36 and I see age lines. But the guy smokes you see him every time you see him. He kind of hides it, but he smokes all the time. And he's not in the exact prime of health. So who knows about that? Another interesting thing, speaking of the Pope again, the pandemic if you remember last fall, there was supposed to be this event called Reinventing the Global Educational Alliance that was to take place at the Vatican on May 14th. I've tried to search. I've not seen anything that officially cancels it, but I can't believe that they would hold it except virtually at this point. So clearly the Pope has his own agenda. There's a scene from Beirut. I think I already talked about that. Another thing from Arab News this morning, Turkey will run out of dollars by July. They've had a major problem with the coronavirus outbreak. Their economy's bad. Erdogan made some decisions that are coming back to challenge him and how he handled it. And who knows how that's going to work out. And again, this is all part of that Ezekiel 38-39 alliance, where we know that it will come together eventually, but right now everybody's dealing with a lot of major problems. Israel also has continued problems. Blue and white. and Likud did form a coalition for an emergency government, unity government. But now there have been petitions filed with the Israeli Supreme Court and the 11 justices of the Israeli Supreme Court are going to decide, is Netanyahu to be barred from forming a government, even though there's legislation that says they can't bar him. But the Supreme Court sort of answers to itself and nobody else in Israel. It's a major scandal. It's even worse than the corruption in the courts that occurred during the Obama administration with the type of judges that were appointed. And so they're supposed to have a hearing this week as to whether they're going to allow Netanyahu to actually go forward and form this government. And the other main thing that's going on in Israel right now is that there's a lot of discussion about the Trump peace plan and whether they can annex land. So that's pretty much the news part of my prophecy update. So I want to make a few comments right now because I have noticed a tremendous amount of acrimony and division among Christian groups on Facebook. It's really not good. So if you have a slightly different view of someone on the virus or the vaccine or Bill Gates or something like that, you're not as holy, you're not as Christian, and I just think this is very troubling. I will refer you, Joel Richardson, who I was emailing with this morning, put up a video about the mark of the beast. Now, you may not agree with him, but I think it's worth listening to because I agree with his heart as to what he said. And I had actually been preparing some of these remarks, and he ended up using the same passages, some of the same passages that I'm going to do. But I'm going to go ahead and use them anyway because I think it's a problem in the body of Christ. A big problem. Now, look, I think the virus is real. I think it's caused some major health problems in some areas. I think it's caused, I think when China shut down, that was going to cause an economic contagion around the world that would be pretty bad. But it's certainly been exacerbated by the various lockdowns that governments have put in place. So I don't want anybody to say that I don't think that it's a problem, but I also think that globalists are using this to their advantage. I think that's clear. Years ago, I've been using this slide, this Time cover magazine, since it came out in, 2010, 2012, 2045. The year man becomes immortal, because then I've talked about this over and over and over again, the development of AI and the attack on privacy and people being tracked. And listen, they don't need a chip in you to track you. I've said this over and over again over the last few months. You carry the tracking device around in your pocket, in your car, whatever. And we use it. We like technology, and it makes our lives easier, but it has pretty much destroyed privacy. I want to go back to the 2018 Davos World Economic Forum, one of the sponsors of Event 201. And I'm going to play Professor Hariri from Israel, Tel Aviv University, who gave a talk and followed up with some questions on being human. What is humanity in the light of artificial intelligence? That was the main theme of the Davos 2018 gathering. So just 2 years ago, we have very high pollen counts, and I'm really struggling, as you can guess. But as we've kind of gone through these lockdowns, you've noticed this terminology that's been used that I'm troubled by. Governments of essential activities and essential employees. Essential businesses and I want to play a clip of Dr. Hariri's comments about what he said. He's a medieval historian and talked about the Dark Ages and serfs. And so take what he said. Now listen, he's an atheist. He lives with his partner. I saw that they made a donation of over $1 million to some of the vaccine research or development. So it's clear where he's coming from. But I also think he's an important voice to listen to because he's saying things that I think are sort of pulling back the curtain. So here he is in a Q&A session talking about sort of comparing medieval serfs to modern day humanity as AI develops and a lot of jobs go away. This is troubling, but listen to him. Hey, guess what? I forgot I do have a, give me 1 second here. Yeah, I just made my sound guy go, what? What? So let me see if I can, hang on here. I got to see if I've got my thing to plug in. Hang on. This is John's bag of tricks. I totally forgot about this. And now I have to check and make sure that it's recognizing the sound card. Give me 1 second. Okay, should play. Here we go. Here's Professor Hariri.
What I wasn't sure about is what your view of the future is, whether you think it's a good thing, whether you're, as a scientist, you're quite entranced by its possibilities, or whether you're as scared as maybe some of the other people that have left the room.
I just don't know. I mean, I don't think that anybody has any idea how the world would look like in 40 or 50 years, let alone a century. The only thing we are certain is that it's going to be completely different from what it is today. I don't remember who said it, but somebody said that if they tell you about the world in 2050 and it sounds like science fiction, it's probably not true. But if they tell you about the world of 2050 and it doesn't sound like science fiction, it's definitely not true. So this is the best I can do. I mean, it was always very difficult to be in charge of your destiny. What is unique now is that the big danger for people is no longer exploitation, it's irrelevance. I mean, previously in history, if you were on the wrong side of history, if you didn't understand what was happening and you lost the competition, then you ended up as some kind of serf or manual laborer being exploited by the people who understand and have the power. Now, if you're left behind, you're facing something far worse, which is to be completely irrelevant. They won't even need you as a serf or as a slave.
Yeah, which is a worrying thing, and of course we're very concerned about how to find meaningful work and meaningful existence for folk in the future, including ourselves. One of the comments by the moderator at the last session in the Congress Center was that Chancellor Merkel, as she passed you in the green room waiting to go on, mentioned that she'd read your book. How?
Well, that's enough of that. So, listen, I fully recognize that there are a lot of things going on that I don't like. I see globalists rising. I see them exerting their influence. I see them doing agenda. I see them putting in systems and places and things that I think in the last period of human history will be used for very evil purposes. I don't think we're at the point where we have a mark of the beast. I know there's been a lot of talk about the quantum dot tattoo and microchips and that type of thing. And I've dug into the technology papers that support the microdot nano dot tattoo to show that you had a particular virus, a vaccine. I don't think it contains all of the information that people need to control you there. They can certainly use that to maybe restrict you from doing certain things. But again, I think your phone is much more important. And the New York Times had a big has had a big series of articles over the last few months since last fall called The Privacy Project, where even they've expressed concerns about the intrusions on privacy that come with the use of technology and artificial intelligence. So this is something that everybody's upset with on all sides of the issue, but there are globalists and other people that want to control everything, and it may be that this is the time that God's going to allow that to happen. I can't discount that possibility. But I just want to cite for you some biblical examples of people who thrived in very bad times. Joseph was taken to Egypt as a prisoner, yet he thrived there. He was thrown in prison, could have been executed. And at the end of his life, he knew he's an example of the suffering servant, a type of the Messiah. And so he thrived in his ministry there, where he provided for people. And when he died, he told the children of Israel, look, I've always been fascinated by this story ever since I first heard it as a little kid. Like, when I die, verse 25, Genesis chapter 50, and Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and ye shall carry up my bones from hence. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. And we know he was there in that coffin for hundreds of years. And then it also, in Exodus, when they go to leave Egypt, this is Exodus chapter 13, I forgot to change the reference. And Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had straitly sworn the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones away hence with you. So, here is what Joseph said hundreds of years before coming to fulfillment. And they took his bones in Joshua 24. They took him to Shechem. They buried him. You can even sometimes go to see his tomb there in the city of Shechem. It's a very big flashpoint between the Arabs and the Israelis, the Jews that live there. It's been burned a number of times, but I was always fascinated by this idea of, this coffin of Joseph being drug all over the wilderness for 40 years. And then even as they started the conquest, it took them a while before they finally took him and buried him in Shechem, not too far from the well that his father Jacob had purchased there in that city, and where later Jesus met the Samaritan woman. You can go see those places today. I've been there. And Jeremiah. Now, a lot of people don't like Jeremiah. Jeremiah was a prophet of the coming destruction of the kingdom of Judah, the southern kingdom. And he was a very popular guy. I do think that the picture of what was going on in Judah at the time is a picture of what the church will be going on in the church at the end of time. And I think it's something that we can see happening right now. But Jeremiah was given a prophecy in Jeremiah 25, and you can read it. I would encourage you to read it, because he talks about you're getting destroyed. This whole land shall be a desolation and astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. And there's a reason for that, because they had violated the Jubilee and the Sabbath years and that type of thing for the period of 70 Sabbaths. So they were punished for that period of time. They were taken out of the land. But it also says in Jeremiah 25, 12, and 13, it says, and look, when I'm done using Babylon to judge you, I'm going to judge Babylon. And I'm going to take them down. And there's prophecies about all of the nations that I think still have yet to be fulfilled throughout the remaining chapters of Jeremiah, including Babylon in Jeremiah 49, or 50 and 51, which I would highly encourage you to read. But Jeremiah, the point is, Jeremiah thrived in his ministry, even though he was oppressed in a very bad time. We know that Ezekiel, he was given a vision of the temple in Ezekiel chapter 8, and he wrote, and he was in Babylon, and he came back, and I've shared this many times. You can read through the passage of Ezekiel 8 talking about the things that were going on that he saw in the temple in Jerusalem. And as he goes deeper into this temple, he just sees more and more things that are abominations to the Lord. Idols, drawings on the walls of the temple, women worshiping Tammuz, men turning their backs on the temple and bowing to the east towards the sun. Just a series of horrific things. And we would not even suggest that Ezekiel's ministry was somehow damaged by the fact that he lived under the oppression of the Babylonian Empire. Similar to what I mentioned about Lot being vexed in his spirit, in Ezekiel chapter 9, men are told to go through the city and slay everyone, but it says, before they do that, it says, go through the midst of the city, through the midst of Jerusalem, and set a mark upon the foreheads of the men that sigh and cry for all the abominations that be done in the midst thereof. And that's the NASB says sigh and groan. And so I think just like if you're vexed like Lot, that's a good sign. If you sigh and groan at all the stuff that you see going on in our world today, and all the stuff you see going on even recently, that's a good sign. You should be concerned. You should take comfort in that. If it doesn't bother you, then you have a problem. But it also talks about a mark that they put on the people. And you can go look up one of my studies on Ezekiel chapter 23, and I talk more about what that mark is. It looks like a cross. So people are marked with the cross of Jesus. And I think that's a picture of what happens in the end time. And then Satan, through his beast system, will try to counterfeit that mark. So the point I'm trying to make is that the mark, we want to talk about, I've been watching this for 50 years or more. And the mark's been everything. It's been barcodes, it's been social security numbers, it's been credit cards, it's been the chip in your credit card, it's been microchips under the skin. Now it's the quantum dot tattoos. And we don't know exactly what it's going to be. Certainly all these things are building up to that, but the bigger part of it is that this is a spiritual thing that you need to be concerned about, much more than the physical thing. Remember what it says in Ephesians chapter 6, that we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against spiritual principalities and high places and spiritual wickedness. And so we have to remember that this is a spiritual battle, and I think we sometimes get distracted by focusing so much on the bricks and mortar or the physical flesh and blood part of what the mark is, and we ignore the spiritual thing, because we don't know exactly what this mark is going to be. But we know that if you take it, your spiritual destination that's what really should be concerned about. And I don't think that God's going to allow believers in him to be deceived by it. I think it will be apparent what it is when it comes. But I'm concerned that everybody wants to run around and say, well, this is the mark, this is the mark. And this has been going on for almost all my life. I'm 66. I've been hearing this, and it's always something different. And this is sure, we're sure, for sure, this is the mark. And none of them have panned out yet. And eventually there will be. And then eventually, people around at that time will be able to say, this is what was prophesied. You need to avoid this. And there will be, as Daniel says, there will be wise that will understand and instruct many. And I believe that verse with all of my heart. So this will happen in the end times. And one more. One of my favorite books, 2 Timothy, particularly chapter 4. And years ago, I don't think it's available anywhere, but I'll have to repeat it sometime. Famous last words. What were people saying that were true believers in the Lord, true followers of the Lord? What were the last things they said? I hesitate to identify the movie because it's not a Hallmark movie, but it's almost as sappy as that. And Pastor Steve's sticking his finger in his mouth. But in it, it's a story about a prince, and he goes to America, goes to college, meets a farm girl, doesn't identify who he is. Eventually, she finds out he's a prince, and he has to go back home to become king. Then she goes to see him, and he goes to his parents and says, I'm going to marry her. And his mother's upset. She's just a commoner. She's just a farm girl. And then his father, the king, who's passing the crown to him, says, do you love the girl? Marry her. And the mother goes, the father is ill, he's dying, that's why he's passing the crown. And he makes a very kind of a profound statement. He turns to the queen and says, no. It's at the end of a man's life that he remembers the decisions he made at the beginning and whether they're important. And so now I'm going to have to give up my man card because I identified the fact that I've actually watched this movie and remembered it and even talked about it in public. So don't tell my golf buddies because I'll never live it down. But we know that in Acts that Paul and Barnabas went out on the missionary journey, and they eventually had a dispute over John Mark. And Mark went with Barnabas, and Paul moved on with Silas. But Mark had a very effective ministry, so much so that at the end of his life, as he's facing execution, under the iron fist of the Roman Empire, Paul says, only Luke is with me, take Mark and bring him with me, for he is profitable to me for the ministry. So when it was important to him, Paul remembered Mark. But the important point, though, is we have Joseph under the Egyptian Empire, which was destroyed and judged by God. We have Jeremiah in the kingdom of Judah that was falling apart because of spiritual wickedness. We have Ezekiel who lived in Babylon, who gave us great prophecies about the end times and the times, I think, in which we're living. We have Daniel, who also thrived in Babylon. In fact, in Daniel chapter 9, he's reading the passage that I referenced in Jeremiah about the 70 years captivity, and he realizes, I'm reading the Word of God, I'm reading Jeremiah, and I realize we have 70 years of judgment. And what does he do? Does he pack his bags? No. He even interpreted the vision of the handwriting on the wall that the kingdom was going to fall that evening. And the next thing we know, Daniel's big in the government of the Medes and Persians. Daniel thrived in the evil empires. So I'm encouraged by that. We've got a lot of questions lately about what do I think about the violation of our constitutional rights and the lockdowns and restrictions. And I don't like them, okay? I detest them. I think they're unconstitutional in many regards. And I don't know if they ever come back. I mean, I've said this before. We believe in the end times, but what do you think the end times really look like, even in America? And is America the thing, or is serving God the thing? Let me put this in a little different perspective. Years ago, I had a very good friend, and I had spoken and written about a book that I consider to be just an absolute abomination, bad theology, blasphemous beyond measure, yet one of the most widely popular Christian books of our time, which is The Shack. And I had spoken against it in pretty stark terms, that this was bad. But what bothered me the most was that Christians, a lot of people who claim to be Christians, love that garbage, theological garbage, excuse me. Really nasty theological garbage. And I had a friend at the time, and he heard what I said, and he wrote me a long, long email. John, we've been good friends. We've talked about a lot of things, spiritual things over the years. But I read the book. I don't think it's that bad. And he went on for like 2 or 3 pages singing the praises of that book. And I wrote to him, I said, my friend, I wrote back to him, I said, listen, we've been friends a long time. We've exchanged emails. And when I talk about something like this, I'm always pointing the finger at myself because I realize I failed. I said, but in all the years of our friendship, you never sent me an email of any length, let alone 3 pages worth, gushing over how great a passage of Scripture was. And yet you droned on for 3 pages gushing over a piece of theological wicked garbage. And I hadn't written to him either. So it was sort of, I think we both need to reorient ourselves. So what I see a lot today is people sending me hundreds of videos, seeing hundreds and hundreds of posts. But unfortunately, and everybody's worked up into a frenzy about this, about Bill Gates, about this vaccine or that. And those are all things to be concerned about. But I think we need to focus on the real thing. Daniel lived in Babylon. It was a wicked empire. I don't know that he had the right of freedom of speech. It does not appear that he does because he spent time in captivity. I assume people were, if he'd had Facebook back in those days, people would have been monitoring it, and he, rather than being in Facebook jail, he actually ended up in jail in the lion's den. We know the story. So I would just say that maybe we all, me included, need to reorient ourselves a little bit. So Daniel, this is from Daniel chapter 9. We know what happens at the prophecy of the 70 weeks at the end, but there's a lot of important stuff at the beginning of this chapter. In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by books the number of years. So what was he doing? He was studying Scripture, and he was like, oh yeah, the Lord told us this was going to happen. Whereof the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. And as I said earlier, his response was not to pack his bags or to go down to the Nebuchadnezzar's palace and protest to lift the lockdown on the people of Judah who had been in captivity there for 7 decades. He's in his 80s. He didn't, here's what he did. And I set my face unto the Lord God to seek by prayer and supplications with fasting and sackcloth and ashes. And I prayed unto the Lord my God and made my confession and said, O Lord, the great and dreadful God, keeping the covenant and mercy to them that love him and to them that keep his commandments. We have sinned and have committed iniquity and have done wickedly and have rebelled, even by departing from thy precepts and from thy judgments. Neither have we hearkened unto thy servants, the prophets, which spake in thy name to our kings, our princes, and our fathers, and to all the people of the land. Verse 9, to the Lord our God belong mercies and forgiveness. Though we have rebelled against him, neither have we obeyed the voice of the Lord our God to walk in his laws, which he set before us by his servants, the prophets. Daniel's response was not to chafe at his circumstances, some of which during certain times were quite grievous, much more oppressive than Facebook jail or being banned by Twitter or something like that. But I think his reaction to all of that was a model for us, that his response was to repent and seek the Lord's forgiveness for the things that had been done among his people. And maybe that would be better for us. I don't like violations of my constitutional rights. But I know that Joseph thrived in Egypt. Ezekiel and Daniel thrived under the oppressive reign of one of the lead. It's such an evil empire that it's sort of a model for the end time beast system. And Paul thrived, and the church flourished under the iron fist of the Roman Empire. I think that God will bring us through this. But I think God's people need to, and I need to focus more on the Lord, his provision, his promises, and follow his ways. Knowing that there's no prophecy that says that Americans will always live under freedom and liberty until the Lord returns. And it might be better. I had this discussion with a friend this week, for us to pray, because we're living at a time where prayer and being in the Word is more important than it has ever been. Father, thank you so much for your Word. Pray that you will bless us this week, give us opportunities to share the gospel, and help us to keep in mind that our lives are to glorify you in everything. In Jesus' name, amen.